The candles flickered on the birthday cake, casting dancing shadows across the dining room where laughter should have filled every corner. Instead, an uncomfortable silence pressed against the walls like fog rolling in from the lake. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and at 42, I thought I'd mastered the art of family gatherings. I'd spent weeks planning my son Danny's 13th birthday party, arranging every detail from the decorations to the guest list. What I hadn't planned for was the moment that would shatter everything I believed about the people I trusted most. Danny walked into the room with his head slightly tilted down, the way kids do when they're trying to hide something. The overhead light caught the purple bruise spreading beneath his left eye like spilled ink on paper. My breath caught in my throat. The chatter around the table died as guests noticed what I was seeing. My sister Rachel, who'd been mid-sentence about her latest promotion, stopped talking entirely. Uncle Mike, Rachel's husband, leaned back in his chair with that smirk I'd grown to despise over the years. He crossed his arms and shrugged like he was discussing the weather. "Just gave the kid a reality check," he said, voice carrying that edge of satisfaction. "Boys need to learn respect, and apparently nobody else was going to teach him." The words landed in the room like stones thrown into still water. Ripples of shocked murmurs spread from table to table. My mother's hand flew to her chest, while my father cleared his throat and looked away. The neighbors who'd come to celebrate suddenly found their plates fascinating. Children stopped eating, sensing the shift in adult energy the way animals sense storms. I felt my world tilt sideways as I processed what Mike had just admitted. This wasn't some playground accident or unfortunate fall. This was deliberate. This was my brother-in-law putting his hands on my child and wearing it like a badge of honor. Danny's eyes met mine across the room, and I saw something there that made my stomach clench. Fear. Not the kind of fear that comes from breaking a window or staying out past curfew. This was deeper, older, the kind that settles into bones and changes how someone moves through the world. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "What exactly did you do to him?" Mike's laugh was harsh and bitter. Kid was getting mouthy about his birthday presents, acting like he deserved everything handed to him. So I showed him what happens when you don't appreciate what you've got. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I watched my sister's face, searching for some sign of shock or disapproval. What I found instead was a careful blankness, the kind of expression people wear when they're trying very hard not to reveal what they're thinking. Rachel's wine glass trembled in her hand as she brought it to her lips. She took a sip that was more like a gulp, then set it down with exaggerated care. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. My neighbor Janet, who'd known Danny since he was a toddler, pushed back from the table. Her chair scraped against the hardwood floor with a sound like fingernails on glass. "I think maybe we should go," she said quietly, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. Other guests began to shift uncomfortably. Conversations that had been flowing easily moments before now felt forced and artificial. The birthday party atmosphere evaporated like morning mist, replaced by something thick and suffocating. I looked at my son again, really looked at him. The bruise was fresh, maybe a day old at most, which meant this had happened recently, probably while he'd been staying at Rachel's house over the weekend. The same weekend she'd assured me would be fun for him, full of cousin bonding and family time. "Danny," I said softly, "when did this happen?" His eyes darted to Rachel, then to Mike, then back to me. "Yesterday," he whispered, "at Aunt Rachel's." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to acknowledge. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest, a mix of rage and betrayal that made it hard to breathe properly. Rachel finally spoke, her voice pitched higher than usual. It wasn't as bad as it looks. Danny was being disrespectful, and Mike just tried to correct him. Kids today don't understand boundaries. Her words felt like a second blow, almost worse than the first. This was my sister, the woman who'd held Danny when he was a baby, who'd promised to always look out for him. and she was sitting here defending the man who'd put bruises on my child. I stood up slowly, feeling every eye in the room track my movement. The birthday cake sat between us, its cheerful frosting and bright candles a mockery of what this day was supposed to be. 13 candles for 13 years of life, and now this moment would be burned into his memory forever. My father cleared his throat again, the way he always did when family tensions rose. Now, Sarah, let's not make a scene. These things happen between family members. We can work this out privately. Those words hit me like a physical slap. Make a scene? My 13-year-old son had been assaulted by my brother-in-law, and my father's concern was about appearances, about keeping things quiet and civilized while Danny sat there with evidence of violence written across his face? The other guests were gathering their things now, murmuring polite excuses about early mornings and prior commitments. Nobody wanted to be here for whatever was about to unfold. I couldn't blame them. If I'd been in their position, I probably would have fled too. But I wasn't in their position. I was Danny's mother, and every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to protect him, to stand between him and anyone who would hurt him, even if that someone shared my blood. Mike leaned forward, elbows on the table, completely unrepentant. Kid needs to learn that. Actions have consequences. You coddle him too much, Sarah. That's why he thinks he can mouth off to adults. The casual cruelty in his voice made my hands shake. This wasn't discipline or correction. This was a grown man taking out his frustrations on a child, and then justifying it with twisted logic about respect and consequences. Rachel's wineglass slipped from her fingers then, falling to the floor where it shattered into a dozen pieces. The crash seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Red wine spread across the white tiles like blood, and she stared down at it with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Sorry," she mumbled, dropping to her knees to gather the larger pieces. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." But I had the strangest feeling she wasn't apologizing for the broken glass. I watched my sister kneel on the floor, her hands trembling as she picked up pieces of broken glass. The wine had splattered across her white blouse, dark stains spreading like accusations. But it was the look on her face that stopped me cold. Not surprise or shock at dropping the glass. Something deeper. Something that looked almost like relief. Danny moved closer to me, his small frame seeking shelter behind my chair. The bruise under his eye seemed darker now under the dining room lights, purple edges fading to yellow where the healing had barely begun. I placed my hand on his shoulder and felt him flinch before leaning into my touch. The remaining guests shuffled toward the door with uncomfortable speed. Mrs. Henderson from next door paused at the threshold, her weathered face creased with concern. "If you need anything, Sarah," she said quietly. "Anything at all." I nodded, not trusting my voice. The front door closed with a soft click, leaving us alone with the wreckage of what was supposed to be a celebration. The birthday cake sat untouched, its bright frosting suddenly garish in the changed atmosphere. Mike remained slouched in his chair, arms crossed, wearing that same satisfied expression, like he'd accomplished something worthwhile. Like putting his hands on my child was some kind of public service. Rachel finally stood, brushing glass fragments from her palms. One had cut her, leaving a thin line of blood across her thumb. She stared at it with the same distant expression she'd worn while watching the wine spread across the floor. "I need to know exactly what happened," I said, my voice steady despite the storm building inside my chest. "Every detail." Mike rolled his eyes. "It wasn't that big a deal. Kid was complaining about his birthday presents not being expensive enough. Said his friends all got better stuff. So I explained to him how ungrateful that sounded." "Explained how?" I pressed. He shrugged, the gesture casual and dismissive, grabbed him by the shoulders, gave him a shake, told him to stop being a spoiled brat. He kept running his mouth, so I had to get firmer with him. The euphemisms made my skin crawl. Firmer. Like violence was just another parenting technique, another tool in the discipline toolkit. I looked at Danny, seeing the way he'd gone very still, the way his breathing had gotten shallow. "Show me," I said to my son. "Show me exactly what Uncle Mike did." Danny's eyes went wide. "Mom, I don't want to. You don't have to be afraid," I told him. "Not anymore, just show me." He moved slowly, like someone walking through deep water. His small hands came up to his own shoulders, demonstrating how Mike had grabbed him. Then he mimicked being shaken, his head snapping back and forth in a way that made my vision go red around the edges. And then, his voice barely above a whisper, Danny said the words that changed everything. He told me I was worthless, just like my dad. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't uncomfortable quiet or tense anticipation. This was the kind of silence that comes after explosions, when the air itself seems stunned into stillness. My ex-husband had walked out on us when Danny was 7, left behind nothing but empty closets and broken promises, disappearing so completely that even the child support checks had stopped coming after 6 months. Danny rarely talked about it, but I knew the abandonment had carved something hollow inside him that I'd been trying to fill ever since, and Mike had used that wound like a weapon. Rachel's face had gone ashen. The blood from her cut thumb was dripping onto her white pants, but she didn't seem to notice. "Mike," she said, voice barely audible, "you didn't tell me you said that." So there were limits to what she'd defend. Apparently, physical violence was acceptable, but attacking a child's deepest insecurity crossed some invisible line she'd drawn for herself. Mike's expression shifted slightly, the smug satisfaction flickering. The kid needed to hear it. Someone has to prepare him for the real world. My father, who'd been silent through most of this exchange, finally spoke up. "Mike, that was uncalled for. The boy's been through enough. Too little, too late. But at least it was something." I knelt down until I was eye level with Danny. His face was flushed now, tears threatening to spill over. "Listen to me," I said, my voice fierce and low. "Nothing he said about you is true. Nothing. You are not worthless. You are not like anyone who would abandon you. You are brave and kind and smart, and you deserve so much better than what happened to you." He nodded, but I could see the damage was already done. Mike's words had found their target, burrowing into all the places where doubt already lived. I stood up and faced my brother-in-law directly. "You will apologize to my son. Now." Mike's laugh was bitter. "For what? Telling him the truth?" The truth. As if a grown man's cruelty could be packaged as wisdom. As if breaking down a child was somehow building him up. Rachel stepped forward, glass crunching under her shoes. "Mike, please, just apologize. Let's move past this." But I was done. Moving past things. Done smoothing over rough edges and keeping peace at the expense of my son's well-being. Done pretending that family loyalty meant accepting whatever treatment people decided to dish out. "No," I said, the word cutting through Rachel's plea. "We're not moving past anything. This ends here." My sister's face crumpled slightly. "Sarah, you're overreacting. It was discipline, not abuse. Kids today are too soft, too protected. Maybe Mike went a little far, but his heart was in the right place." His heart. As if good intentions could erase the bruise under my son's eye. As if caring about Danny's character development justified traumatizing him on his birthday. I looked around the dining room, taking in the scattered remnants of the party. Crumpled napkins and abandoned plates. The broken wine glass Rachel hadn't finished cleaning up. The birthday cake with its unlit candles, because we'd never gotten to the singing and wish-making part of the celebration. All of it ruined by one man's decision that my child needed to be put in his place. My mother, who'd been silent through most of the confrontation, finally found her voice. "Maybe we should all take a step back and cool down. These things always seem worse in the heat of the moment. Cool down." As if my anger was the problem here. As if the appropriate response to my son being assaulted was to take some deep breaths and count to 10. Danny tugged on my sleeve. "Mom, can we go upstairs? I don't want to be here anymore." The exhaustion in his voice broke something inside me. This was supposed to be his special day, and instead it had become a battlefield where adults fought over whether he deserved basic human dignity. "Of course, sweetheart," I said. "Go on up. I'll be there in a minute." He hesitated at the doorway, looking back at the assembled adults who'd failed him so spectacularly. Then he was gone, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. I turned back to face them all. My family, the people who were supposed to protect him, support him, love him unconditionally. Instead, they'd stood by while he was hurt and then asked me to pretend it didn't matter. The birthday party was over, but this conversation was just beginning. Just beginning. The room felt smaller now with just family remaining. The guests had fled like birds from a storm, leaving behind only the people who couldn't escape their blood ties. I stood there looking at each face in turn, memorizing this moment when everything changed. When I stopped pretending that keeping the peace was worth more than keeping my son safe. Mike shifted in his chair, finally showing the first crack in his arrogant facade. "Maybe I came on a little strong," he said, the words grudging and hollow. But the kid was being a brat about his presence. Someone had to set him straight. A little strong. That's what he called giving my 13-year-old son a black eye and telling him he was worthless. That's what passed for an apology in his world. I felt something cold settle in my chest, a clarity I hadn't experienced before. This wasn't about discipline or teaching moments or tough love. This was about a man who enjoyed hurting someone smaller than himself. Rachel knelt by the broken glass again, her movements jerky and distracted. She kept glancing between Mike and the stairs where Danny had disappeared, like she was trying to solve an equation that didn't have clean numbers. The cut on her thumb had stopped bleeding, but she kept pressing it with her other hand anyway. "I need everyone to leave," I said quietly. My voice carried further than shouting would have, cutting through the thick air like a blade. "This conversation is over." My father stepped forward, hands raised in that placating gesture he'd perfected over decades of family disputes. "Now, Sarah, let's think about this rationally. Family fights happen. We work through them together. Rationally." The word tasted bitter in my mouth. There was nothing rational about what had happened here. Nothing logical about adults defending violence against a child. Nothing reasonable about asking me to forget that my son had been hurt by someone who was supposed to protect him. My mother nodded along with Dad's words, her face creased with the kind of worry that focused entirely on the wrong things. What will people think if word gets out about this? The Hendersons were here, and you know how Janet talks. This could follow Danny for years if it becomes gossip. The casual cruelty of her concern hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't worried about Danny's emotional well-being or the bruise under his eye or the way he'd flinched when I touched his shoulder. She was worried about reputation, about what the neighbors might whisper over their morning coffee. I looked at Rachel, searching her face for some sign of the sister I'd grown up with, the woman who'd helped me through my divorce, who'd held my hand in the hospital when Danny broke his arm falling off his bike, the person who'd promised to always be there for us when his father walked away. Instead, I found a stranger wearing my sister's face, someone who could watch a man hurt my child and then ask me to understand his perspective. "You knew," I said to her, the realization hitting me like cold water. "You knew he had a temper. You knew he was rough with kids. And you let me send Danny there anyway." Rachel's hands stilled on the glass fragments. Her shoulders drew up tight around her ears, the defensive posture of someone who'd been caught in a lie they'd been telling themselves. "It's not that simple," she whispered. "It is exactly that simple," I shot back. "You knew Mike had anger issues and you said nothing. You let me drop my son off at your house, and when he came back bruised, you helped cover it up." The accusation hung between us like smoke. Rachel's face crumpled, and for a moment she looked like the little girl I'd shared a bedroom with for 16 years. The sister who'd cried, when I left for college, who'd called me every week during my first semester because she missed having someone to talk to. But that girl had grown into a woman who chose her husband's violence over her nephew's safety, who prioritized keeping her marriage intact over keeping a child from harm. "I've seen him get frustrated before," Rachel admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "With his own kids, with mine. But I never thought he'd actually hurt Danny. I thought he just needed to blow off steam. Blow off steam. Another euphemism to wrap around ugly truth. Another way to minimize what couldn't be minimized. I wondered how many times she'd used that phrase to explain away bruises on her own children, how many incidents she'd reframed as misunderstandings or moments of stress. Mike stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I don't have to sit here and listen to this," he said, voice rising. "The kid was out of line and I corrected him. End of story." But it wasn't the end. It was barely the beginning. Because now I had to figure out how to help Danny heal from this. How to rebuild his trust in the adults who were supposed to keep him safe. How to explain that sometimes family members hurt you and other family members let them. My father tried one more time to broker peace. "Sarah, you're upset right now, and rightfully so. But think about what you're doing. If you push Mike away, you push Rachel away too. Is that really what you want? To tear the family apart over a misunderstanding?" A misunderstanding. That's what my son's black eye had become in their collective narrative. Not assault, not abuse, just a communication breakdown between a well-meaning uncle and a mouthy nephew. I looked up at the ceiling, imagining Danny in his room above us. Probably sitting on his bed holding the ice pack I'd given him earlier, trying to make sense of why his birthday had exploded into adult conflict. Trying to understand why the people he trusted had failed him so completely. When I looked back down, my vision was clear and my voice was steady. "You're right, Dad. I am going to tear this family apart. Because this family was already broken the moment you all decided that keeping Mike's feelings intact was more important than keeping my son safe." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of shock across their faces. My mother gasped softly. Rachel's hands flew to her mouth. Even Mike looked taken aback by the finality in my voice. I walked to the front door and opened it wide. The evening air rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of storms. "Get out," I said simply. "All of you." They filed past me one by one, my father muttering about hasty decisions and cooler heads prevailing. My mother clutching her purse like a shield, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Mike stalking past without acknowledgement, his jaw set in stubborn lines. Rachel lingered at the threshold, looking back at me with desperate eyes. "Sarah, please, don't do this. We can fix it. We can make it right." But some things couldn't be fixed with apologies and promises to do better. Some wounds went too deep for bandages and time to heal. Some betrayals carved scars that never fully faded. "You had your chance to make it right," I told her. "When Danny first came home with that bruise, when Mike admitted what he'd done, when you chose to defend him instead of protecting my son. You made your choice then." She opened her mouth to argue, but I closed the door gently but firmly. The click of the lock engaging sounded unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. I stood in my hallway for a long moment, processing what had just happened. In the span of an hour, I'd lost my entire extended family, cut ties with people I'd known my whole life, chosen my son's well-being over decades of shared history and blood relationships, and I felt lighter than I had in months. Upstairs, I could hear Danny moving around in his room, probably changing out of his birthday clothes, washing his face, trying to scrub away the memory of hands that had grabbed him and words that had cut him. I climbed the stairs slowly, giving myself time to find the right words for what came next. His door was cracked open, spilling warm light into the dark hallway. I knocked softly and waited for permission before entering. Danny sat on his bed, still in his birthday shirt but with his shoes off. The ice pack I'd given him earlier lay forgotten on his nightstand. "How are you doing, sweetheart?" I asked, settling beside him on the rumpled comforter. He shrugged, a gesture that tried to minimize what couldn't be minimized. "Are they gone? All of them?" Yes, I said. They're gone. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. Good, I don't want to see Uncle Mike anymore. Or Aunt Rachel either, since she didn't stop him. The clarity in his voice surprised me. At 13, Danny had already learned lessons about loyalty and protection that some adults never mastered. He understood that standing by while someone got hurt made you complicit in their pain. I'm sorry, I told him. I'm sorry I didn't protect you better. I'm sorry I let you go there when I should have seen the warning signs. Danny leaned against my shoulder, his weight warm and solid. You didn't know, Mom. Adults are good at hiding things from each other. His forgiveness felt like a gift I hadn't earned yet. But I would. I would spend whatever time it took helping him heal from this, rebuilding his trust in the world and the people in it. What happens now? He asked. Now we figure out how to move forward, I said. Just the two of us, if that's what it takes. He was quiet for a long moment, processing possibilities and futures that looked different than what we'd planned yesterday. Then, in a voice that sounded older than his 13 years, he said something that broke my heart and healed it at the same time. I think that might be better anyway. Outside, rain began to fall against the windows. The sound was gentle and rhythmic, washing away the last traces of a birthday party that had turned into something else entirely. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations with school counselors and possibly police officers. There would be family members who wouldn't understand my choice, friends who would ask why I couldn't just forgive and move on. But tonight, in the soft glow of Danny's bedroom lamp, with my son safe beside me and the house finally quiet, I knew I had made the right decision. Some bonds were worth breaking when breaking them meant keeping the people you loved whole. The birthday cake downstairs would go uneaten, its 13 candles never lit. But there would be other birthdays, other celebrations, other chances to make wishes and believe they might come true. And when those moments came, they would be filled with people who understood that love meant protection, not harm. People who knew that sometimes the most important gift you can give someone is the courage to walk away from those who would hurt them, even when those people share your name and your history and your blood. Your blood. The next morning brought the kind of silence that feels deliberate, chosen rather than accidental. I woke before my alarm, the house wrapped in that particular quiet that comes after storms pass through and leave everything changed in their wake. Danny was still sleeping when I checked on him, his face peaceful in the early light filtering through his curtains. The bruise had darkened overnight, purple spreading like spilled ink across his cheekbone. I made coffee in a kitchen that felt different somehow, as if the confrontation the night before had rearranged more than just the furniture. The birthday cake still sat on the counter, its bright frosting now looking garish in the morning light. 13 unlit candles stood like tiny sentries guarding wishes that would never be made. My phone had been buzzing since 6 a.m. Text messages from my mother, voicemails from Rachel, even a terse message from my father asking me to reconsider my position. I deleted them all without reading past the first few words. Some conversations were finished before they started, and this was one of them. Danny emerged around 8, padding into the kitchen in his pajamas with that careful way kids move when they're testing how much the world has shifted overnight. He glanced at the cake, then at me, then poured himself a glass of orange juice like it was any other Tuesday morning. "Are you okay?" he asked, settling into his usual chair at the breakfast table. The question caught me off guard. After everything he'd been through, he was worried about me. It was such a Danny thing to do, putting other people's feelings ahead of his own, even when he was the one who'd been hurt. "I should be asking you that," I said, sitting across from him with my coffee mug wrapped between my palms. He shrugged, a gesture that had become his default response to difficult questions. "I keep thinking about what Uncle Mike said, about being like Dad." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. My ex-husband had been many things, most of them disappointing, but worthless wasn't one of them. Selfish, yes. Unreliable, absolutely. But Danny carried none of those traits. And the fact that Mike had planted that poison in his mind made my vision go red around the edges all over again. "Your father left because he couldn't handle responsibility," I said carefully. "That was about his character, not yours. You are nothing like him in the ways that matter." Danny nodded, but I could see the doubt still lurking behind his eyes. 13 years old, and already learning that words from adults could cut deeper than any physical wound, that sometimes the people who claimed to love you were the ones who knew exactly where to aim their cruelty. The phone rang then, jarring us both out of the moment. Rachel's name flashed on the caller ID and I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. And again. On the fourth call, Danny looked up from his cereal bowl with an expression older than his years. "She's not going to stop," he said quietly. He was right. Rachel had always been persistent when she wanted something, and right now she wanted forgiveness that I wasn't ready to give. Maybe wouldn't ever be ready to give. I answered on the fifth ring. "What do you want, Rachel?" "Sarah, thank God, I've been calling all morning. We need to talk." "We talked last night. You made your position clear." Her voice cracked slightly. "I didn't sleep at all. I keep thinking about what happened, about what Mike said to Danny. It was wrong, Sarah. I know it was wrong." Too little. Too late. The phrase echoed in my head like a warning bell. How many times had I heard similar words from her over the years? How many times had she apologized for Mike's behavior while continuing to enable it? "Where were you when it happened?" I asked. "When your husband was putting his hands on my son, where were you?" Silence stretched across the phone line. In the background, I could hear the sounds of her household morning routine. Her own kids getting ready for school, dishes clattering, the television news playing softly. Normal sounds of a normal morning in a house where violence was just another Tuesday. "I was in the kitchen," she finally admitted, "making lunch for the kids. I heard voices getting loud, but I thought it was just Mike being firm with him." Firm. Another euphemism to wrap around ugly truth. Another way to avoid looking directly at what had happened under her own roof while she made sandwiches and pretended not to hear. "You heard my son being hurt and you did nothing," I said, each word deliberate and clear. "I didn't know," she said, voice rising with desperation. "If I had known he was actually hitting Danny, I would have stopped it." "He has a black eye, Rachel. That doesn't happen from a conversation." Danny looked up from his cereal, meeting my eyes across the table. There was something in his expression that reminded me of myself at his age. That moment when you realize that adults aren't the infallible protectors you thought they were. That sometimes you have to protect yourself because the people who should be doing it are too busy protecting other things. "I want to make this right," Rachel continued. "Mike feels terrible about what happened. He wants to apologize properly, maybe take Danny somewhere special to make up for it." The suggestion was so tone-deaf it took my breath away. She actually thought this could be fixed with an apology and a trip to the arcade. That trauma could be erased with the right combination of remorse and entertainment. "You think an apology fixes this?" I asked. "It's a start. People make mistakes, Sarah. Family forgives each other." There it was, the expectation that had been hanging over us since childhood. Family forgives. Family overlooks. Family keeps quiet when keeping quiet means keeping peace, no matter what the cost to the people getting hurt in the process. "Some mistakes are too big for forgiveness," I told her. Danny finished his cereal and rinsed his bowl in the sink, moving with the careful economy of motion that kids develop when they're trying not to draw attention to themselves. He'd been doing it more often lately, I realized, making himself smaller, quieter, less likely to trigger adult anger. "Sarah, please, don't throw away our whole relationship over this. Think about what Mom and Dad would say." I almost laughed at that. Our parents, who had spent the previous evening more concerned about neighborhood gossip than their grandson's well-being, who had asked me to consider Mike's feelings while Danny sat there with evidence of violence written across his face. "Mom and Dad made their position clear last night," I said. "So did you. So did Mike. Everyone chose their side. It doesn't have to be about sides. It became about sides the moment your husband put his hands on my son, and you decided that was acceptable." I hung up before she could respond. The phone immediately started ringing again, but I turned off the ringer and set it face down on the counter. Some conversations were finished whether all parties agreed or not. Danny had been listening to my side of the exchange, and now he looked at me with something that might have been relief mixed with sadness. "She wanted us to forgive him, didn't she?" "Yes." "Are you going to?" The question deserved an honest answer, even if it was complicated, especially because it was complicated. Danny was old enough to understand that the world wasn't divided into simple categories of good and evil, that sometimes people we love make choices that hurt us. "I don't know," I said finally. "Forgiveness isn't something you can force or rush. Maybe someday I'll be able to forgive them for what happened. But forgetting is different from forgiving, and protecting you is more important than either one." He nodded, processing this with the seriousness he brought to all difficult topics. "I don't think I want to see Uncle Mike again, even if he apologizes." "You don't have to. You never have to be around people who hurt you, no matter who they are or what they say afterward." Relief flickered across his features. How long had he been carrying the worry that he'd be forced to pretend everything was fine? That he'd have to smile and accept apologies from someone who'd used his deepest insecurities as weapons? The doorbell rang then, sharp and insistent. Through the front window, I could see my mother's car in the driveway, and her familiar silhouette on the front porch. She'd come to broker peace, to smooth over rough edges, to convince me that family harmony was worth more than my son's safety. "Stay here," I told Danny, moving toward the door. But he followed anyway, staying close behind me like he was afraid to be alone even in his own house. The events of the previous night had shaken his sense of security in ways that would take time to heal. I opened the door but didn't invite her in. My mother stood on the porch in her good coat, the one she wore to church and doctor's appointments and other occasions that required respectability. Her face was creased with the kind of worry that focused on all the wrong things. "Sarah, honey, we need to talk about what happened last night." "No, we don't." She blinked, clearly not expecting such immediate resistance. "You're upset, and I understand that, but you can't cut off the whole family over a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. Even now, standing on my doorstep while Danny pressed close behind me, she was calling it a misunderstanding. I looked at this woman who had raised me, who had taught me to tie my shoes and say my prayers, and saw a stranger who valued appearances over truth. "It wasn't a misunderstanding, Mom. It was assault, and every one of you chose to defend it rather than protect him." Her face crumpled, age lines deepening with disappointment. "Think about what you're doing to this family, Sarah. Think about the legacy you're leaving Danny." I turned to look at my son, this brave boy who had endured physical violence and emotional cruelty and still worried about my feelings, who had learned hard lessons about loyalty and protection that some adults never master. The legacy I was leaving him wasn't broken relationships with toxic people. It was the knowledge that he deserved better, that love meant protection, not harm. "The legacy I'm leaving him," I said, voice steady and sure, "is that his safety matters more than anyone's comfort, that he's worth protecting, even when that protection costs me everything I thought I wanted to keep." Danny's hand slipped into mine, small fingers squeezing tight. In that gesture, I found all the confirmation I needed. Some bridges are worth burning when crossing them means carrying the people you love to safety. Some families are worth losing when keeping them means losing yourself. I closed the door gently but firmly, the click of the lock echoing in the quiet morning air. Behind us lay the wreckage of relationships built on silence and compromise. Ahead of us stretched the uncertain but honest path of building something better, together.